The one objection I have to Martin Luther King Day is we tend to celebrate not Martin Luther King, but an icon. We celebrate his birthday, but we celebrate a sanitized version of Martin Luther King. We celebrate a plastic saint. And Martin Luther King wasn't a plastic saint. He was a human being. He was a great human being. And I'm concerned that one day we'll celebrate Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday by going to sales at malls the way we celebrate days honoring George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. When we think about the flaws that have come out in King's character, I think it's worth speculating just for a minute. If we wait for saints to have social change, we're going to wait a very, very long time to have any change. I think we need to make do with what we've got, and what we've got are human beings. Human beings are flawed. Martin Luther King was flawed. It doesn't stop him from being a very great human being and from having accomplished an enormous amount during his lifetime. In 1954, the Supreme Court declared that segregated public schools violated the Constitution, that separate was inherently unequal. But perhaps the most significant part of that decision was it laid the groundwork for a mass movement on behalf of civil rights. Blacks now had the law on their side. Segregation was unconstitutional. Before this, blacks had had to rely on the conscience of whites, which had proved to be a very weak reed indeed. Now the law itself had declared segregation violated the Constitution. And the first major event to rally support for this movement came from what might seem at first glance like an unlikely source. On December 1st, 1955, a 40-year-old black seamstress began a revolution. She refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, when she was ordered to do so by the bus driver. Now, there's a lot of nonsense written about what Rosa Parks did. She was not some poor, tired old woman who just had had enough and was too tired to give up her seat. Rosa Parks was an activist. She was the secretary of the local branch of the NAACP. She'd been arrested for violating Montgomery segregation ordinances before. She knew perfectly well what she was doing. She was making a revolution. Her refusal violated Montgomery's segregation ordinance, which required that the first 4 seats of every bus be reserved for whites only, and that after that, whites sit from the front to the back, and blacks would sit from the back to the front. If a bus were crowded, blacks had to surrender their seats to whites, and blacks and whites could not share seats on the buses. The way the police normally handled a situation like Rosa Parks was they accused the violator with disturbing the peace. Rosa Parks did not want that to happen, though, and her dignified bearing and her orderly conduct made the Montgomery police, when they were called, charge her with violating the segregation ordinance, which was important because that brought Montgomery's segregation ordinance into the courts. And of course, this is after the Brown decision. That evening, the black community of Montgomery mobilized. They rallied behind a group of women, Joanne Robinson, who was also an activist, and behind 2 older and established leaders of the black community, the Reverend Vernon Johns and E.D. Nixon, who was head of the Pullman Car Porters Union, the local branch, and also was head of the NAACP at various times. They were joined by 2 young ministers, Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King Jr. This group formed an organization they called the Montgomery Improvement Association. They organized a boycott of the city's buses. And perhaps more important than that, they also organized a carpool to get blacks who needed transportation from one place to another. It was important because it drew middle-class blacks into the protest. For the most part, it was working-class blacks who needed to ride the buses. But middle-class blacks had cars. And as they joined the protest, the demands expanded. Ralph Abernathy was the pastor of the First Baptist Church. He was an influential young minister who didn't have King's education. He came from a very poor rural background. He was one of 12 children of a sharecropper, in fact. He also came from southern black schools, Alabama State and Atlanta University. He was 4 years older than King. He'd been in Montgomery longer. He was more influential in Montgomery. In fact, his was the only church that the organizers of the boycott could use for their meetings. Martin Luther King, on the other hand, was brand new to Montgomery. He'd been in the community for less than a year. But he emerged as the leader of the boycott, and he put his own particular stamp on it. I think there are several reasons. All of the reasons make it seem unlikely that King would emerge as a leader, but they're the very reasons why he did. First, he was very young. He was 26 years old. Second, he'd been in Montgomery only a year, and he'd spent a great part of that year writing his own doctoral dissertation, the one that we now know caused so many problems. He had never been part of an organized protest for civil rights. He had been active in the NAACP, but had turned down a chance to be president. Now, these seeming drawbacks all turned into advantages because Montgomery's black community was faction-ridden. They had a great deal of difficulty uniting behind any one leader, behind any one cause, and King was an outsider in a sense, or a newcomer at least. And therefore, he hadn't been associated with one faction or another and could bring the community together in a way that nobody else could. He also placed his own stamp on the movement. He said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." But at the same time, he convinced his colleagues to operate, as he put it, through persuasion, not coercion. He preached love. He quoted Booker T. Washington, whose famous phrase was, "Let no man pull you so low as to make you hate him." Martin Luther King advocated nonviolent direct action. And as King explained it, the nonviolent resistor refuses to hate. As King wrote, "He seeks not to defeat or humiliate his opponent, but to win his friendship and his understanding." The boycott was overwhelmingly successful. On December 5th, 1955, the first scheduled day of the boycott, fewer than a dozen blacks rode Montgomery's buses. Normally, blacks made up about 70% of the ridership. But this boycott, which seemed so revolutionary, really wasn't. At first, the boycott did not even challenge segregation. In fact, it didn't even meet the standards the NAACP had prescribed as the minimum standards for desegregation. They asked only that bus drivers treat blacks courteously, and that didn't mean calling them sir necessarily. It meant not pulling away the minute a black came up to the door and sort of leaving them in the dust, which was common practice. They asked that the seating be whites from front to back, blacks from back to front, on a first-come, first-served basis. They didn't even challenge segregation. And they did ask that some black drivers be hired, at least on mostly black routes. But the middle classes who got involved through the carpools expanded the vision, expanded the demands of the boycott. And pretty soon segregation itself became a target. The success of the boycott outraged some segments of the white community. The white community began, or at least parts of it, began a campaign of harassment. They canceled the insurance on cars used in the boycott. No black who used a car in a boycott could find insurance anyplace. Finally, the MIA, the Montgomery Improvement Association, went to Lloyd's of London and got them to underwrite all of the cars used in the carpool. On January 30th, 1956, a new form of harassment, if you can call it that, was tried. Dynamite tore apart Martin Luther King's home. An angry black mob gathered outside of his home, and only an impassioned plea from King prevented violence right then and there. And then in February of 1956, 100 leaders of the boycott were indicted under an old Alabama law which prohibited certain kinds of boycotts. In March, Judge Eugene Carter, an Alabama state judge, found 89 of the defendants guilty of violating the law, and he also issued an injunction which prohibited the carpool. But in June, in federal court, the boycott fared better. The NAACP had taken the case to federal court, challenging the constitutionality of the segregation ordinance, and in June, a 3-judge panel overruled Montgomery's segregation ordinance, and they enjoined the mayor and other city officials from enforcing it. In November, the Supreme Court upheld the decision. On December 21st, 1956, Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, Edie Nixon, and Glenn Smiley, a white minister, got on board a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and sat in the front seats. King sat next to Smiley. But a week later, violence erupted yet again. A shotgun blast tore through King's home. Snipers fired on the newly integrated buses. A black teenage girl was pulled off a bus and beaten. Dynamite blew apart not only Abernathy's home, but his church as well. And explosions destroyed other black churches in the city, too. At this point, the city government finally rallied, at least if not to support the Constitution to support law and order. The law enforcement officials of the city arrested 7 white men for the bombings, and in spite of the fact that they had signed confessions from all of them, an all-white jury acquitted them. The arrest seemed to have exhausted the city's commitment to law and order. But the fact was that bus service resumed eventually. It resumed on an integrated basis. The MIA had lasted a year. It had united the black community. It had virtually bankrupted the Montgomery City line, but it hadn't gained one concession. It was the old-fashioned strategy of the NAACP, who took the city ordinance to court, that really produced the victory. But still, Montgomery was important, extraordinarily important. It produced an important black leader. It publicized a new tactic. Martin Luther King himself said about Montgomery, "Our nonviolent protest in Montgomery is important because it's demonstrating to the Negro, North and South, that many stereotypes he has held about himself and other Negroes are not valid. Montgomery has broken the spell and is ushering in concrete manifestations of the thinking and action of the new Negro. We know now that the Southern Negro has come of age politically. No matter what sacrifices we have to make, we will not let anybody drag us down so low as to hate them." That speech, or that address, set the tone and established a strategy for a new civil rights movement, a movement that sought integration, literally the incorporation of blacks into American society. And they sought to do this through nonviolent direct action, through nonviolent passive resistance. And this is especially important because the tactic of nonviolent direct action was well suited to the goal, which was integration. King called it the sword that heals, an attempt to win people rather than to defeat people. But the most significant result, really, of Montgomery was the emergence of a dynamic new leader for black Americans, Martin Luther King, Jr. King's grandfather, on his father's side, had been a slave who was freed when Sherman took Atlanta. After the Civil War, he worked as a sharecropper, and his son, Martin Luther King Sr., or Daddy King, as most everyone who had anything to do with the civil rights movement called him, took off for Atlanta as a young man, worked as a mechanic, called to the ministry. He went to Morehouse College and married the daughter of the most influential black minister in the city, Reverend Adam Williams, the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. And when Williams died in 1931, Daddy King took over. Daddy King was an active Republican, as most blacks were in those days, a member of the NAACP, and a phenomenally successful businessman. By the time Martin Luther King was born in 1929, the Kings lived in the most affluent black section of Atlanta, very near Morehouse College, in a more than comfortable home. Martin Luther King Jr.'s childhood was more secure, more comfortable than that of the vast majority of blacks in the segregated South. But in spite of that, he still faced daily discrimination and segregation. He often told the story of walking into a shoe store with his father when he was a young boy and being denied service, and his father's anger. But his father also always taught him not to respond in kind, to turn the other cheek. Daddy King taught that a prejudiced person was to be pitied, not to be hated. Martin Luther King Jr. flew through elementary and secondary school skipping grades. He grew up in the shadow of Morehouse College and entered Morehouse at the age of 15 in 1944. Daddy King hoped that his son would enter the ministry, but young Martin didn't want to. He was embarrassed by the emotionalism of his father's and his grandfather's sermons. He believed also that religion was a kind of anesthetic for blacks, that it substituted aspirations in the afterlife for aspirations here on earth. King thought about going into law, but he also came under the influence of the magnificent minister teachers at Morehouse College, particularly Benjamin Mays, the president of the college, and George Kelsey. They taught him that religion could be socially relevant, and especially Mays, who was a significant black theologian, believed in Christian social responsibility, and they convinced King. In 1947, he was ordained, much to the surprise, I suppose, of everybody except Daddy King. At Morehouse, he read Henry David Thoreau and was particularly taken with Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience. Thoreau, much more dramatically than courageously, had refused to pay his taxes during the Mexican-American War and had spent a night in jail in protest. It was only a night, after all. But King was taken with Thoreau's idea, expressed in that essay, that an individual can withhold support from a corrupt or unjust law or an unjust system of government. You can protest simply by withholding your participation. In 48, King graduated from Morehouse and enrolled in Crozier Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, where he was an outstanding student and where he became particularly fascinated with Hegel's work and the idea of a dialectic and a synthesis. That became, I think, the basis of King's own intellectual approach to things. He also read Marx, but at this point, curiously enough, he rejected Marx because Marx rejected religion. He was much more influenced by Walter Rauschenbusch and the social gospel. He wrote, "It has been my conviction ever since reading Rauschenbusch that any religion which professes to be concerned about the souls of men and is not concerned about the social and economic conditions that scar that soul is spiritually moribund, waiting only for the day to be buried." His most important ideas came from Thoreau, Rauschenbusch, and the Indian leader Mahatma Gandhi. King himself said Gandhi was probably the first person in history to lift the love ethic of Jesus above mere interaction between individuals to a powerful and effective force on a large scale. It was this Gandhian emphasis on love and nonviolence in which I discovered the method for social reform I had been seeking. But King also read and was influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr, a conservative or neoconservative theologian. I think Niebuhr was important for two reasons to King. One is that he provided a kind of pessimism that was a counterbalance to the optimism of Rauschenbusch. Niebuhr was, as I said, neoconservative. He believed in the sinful nature of humanity and the fact that humans just aren't perfectible. And this provided kind of a counterbalance for King. And what's more, Niebuhrian theology was much closer to the old-time religion of King's father and his grandfather. And it provided him a comfortable basis, if an intellectualized one, to incorporate a new train of thought into the liberal optimism of the social gospel. In 1951, King enrolled in Boston University for a PhD in philosophy. He began a thesis comparing the opposing theological views of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman. Characteristically for King at the time, and I think throughout his life, he attempted a synthesis of two very opposing theological worldviews. In 1954, he was offered a job at Morehouse College to come back and teach, and he was attracted by it. I think if things had gone differently, he might well have gone into academic life. But before he did that, he wanted experience as a practicing, active minister. And so he took a job at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, a middle-class, comfortable congregation. From there, of course, he went on to lead the boycott and became a national figure. The boycott brought him to national attention first, but he really emerged on the national scene in a big way with the prayer pilgrimage in 1957. A variety of black organizations, the NAACP, National Urban League, the Congress of Racial Equality, organized a protest. The Eisenhower administration had introduced a civil rights bill in 1956. It had been rejected by Congress, and the administration reintroduced it in 1957. And a group of blacks got together and staged a protest in Washington, drew 35,000 people demanding passage of this bill. As it turned out, only 2 of the 4 provisions actually passed Congress. But Roy Wilkins of the NAACP and James Farmer, of course, spoke, established black leaders, A. Philip Randolph. And more than that, black celebrities, the great baseball player Jackie Robinson, Harry Belafonte spoke. But it was Martin Luther King Jr., who was then still under 30, who captured the audience. In the speech that in some ways is reminiscent of the I Have a Dream speech of several years later, he took one theme, give us the vote, and hammered it home. Give us the vote, he said. We won't be back here begging for someone to take care of our rights. Give us the vote and you'll never have to hear from us again. Give us the vote, we'll be empowered. King emerged from this as perhaps the acknowledged leader of black America. Yet he was uncertain where to lead. The bus boycott hadn't touched off a chain reaction. In fact, the very genius of the bus boycott was that people could participate by doing nothing, by not riding. But that makes it very difficult to spread. King wasn't sure exactly how to take his message and move it on to other communities in the South. In 1957, he called together a group of black ministers in Atlanta and founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But unlike the NAACP, it never had the money or the efficient organization to help organize campaigns at the local level. And what's more, in all honesty, King was not a great organizer. He never was. He was never a very good administrator. And especially at these early stages of his career, his leadership, I think, has been often exaggerated. We look back. He was a very young man, and he was thrust into a position of leadership with the boycott. He didn't lead the boycott, he didn't start the boycott, he didn't organize it. He emerged as a leader. He was thrust into a position of leadership. In 1959, he resigned from the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He moved to Atlanta to work on the SCLC full-time. He was looking for a new method to expand nonviolent direct action throughout the South. A new method emerged the next year, but Martin Luther King didn't originate it. 4 black freshmen at North Carolina A&T did when they walked into a Woolworth's, bought some school supplies, and sat down at the lunch counter, which they weren't supposed to be served. They were supposed to go to the end of the lunch counter and take out their food. And they asked for a hamburger and a Coke, and when they were refused, they sat there and continued to sit. It spread throughout the South. 70,000 people within a few months participated in sit-ins all over the South in every southern state. But in spite of the fact that King did not organize or in any way really lead the sit-in movement, it was King's ideas that spurred the sit-in movement. All 4 of the freshmen at North Carolina A&T had read King's Stride Toward Freedom. It was King's idea of nonviolent direct action, passive resistance, that gave fire to the sit-in movement. And I think this is really the importance of Martin Luther King as a leader of the civil rights movement. When we talk about the civil rights movement, basically we're talking about the 10 or 11 years after the Brown decision. And King really was the leader of that movement. He didn't do so because or emerge as the leader because his ideas were new. They weren't. They weren't even new to America. William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, had proposed similar things back in the early 19th century. So, for that matter, had Henry David Thoreau. In more modern times, the black labor leader A. Philip Randolph had proposed very similar things. And during World War II, a group of Methodist pacifists formed CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, to pursue racial equality through means of nonviolent direct action. King's leadership was important because he was the one who sold this idea to the masses. And King was able to do so for 2 basic reasons. One was his amazingly charismatic personality, and the other was his power with words. He was an extraordinarily charismatic individual. Church women loved him at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Behind his back, they called him LLJ, the Little Lord Jesus. Rufus King, who was part of the MIA, talked about Martin Luther King's speaking style. He said, he was sincere. He could make you hear and feel what he was saying. He could lift you out of it yourself. And I suppose that could be said of most really great preachers, but it certainly was true of Martin Luther King, Jr. Personally, he was an individual of enormous self-possession. In 1958, he was autographing copies of Stride Toward Freedom when a black woman walked up to him and stabbed him in the chest with a letter opener. Martin Luther King sat absolutely still, and although everyone around him was hysterical and trying to help, he wouldn't let himself be moved until the paramedics arrived, the ambulance, to take him to the hospital. When he was operated on, it was found that the letter opener was literally resting against his heart, and had he been moved or jerked around violently, he would have died. And that's an individual of extraordinary self-possession and calm. But at the same time, King was no ascetic. He was no saint. He loved sports. He loved food, especially down-home food, soul food. He had trouble with his weight throughout his adult life. He loved good clothes, spent enormous amounts of money on his clothes. He had affairs with women both before and after his marriage. And the FBI tapes, if nothing else, revealed that pretty clearly. And of course, he plagiarized parts of his doctoral dissertation and other papers in graduate school. He was a human being. He was a flawed human being. But the real key to his leadership was his personality and his power with words. He spoke with the cadences of a black preacher. His sermons and his speeches were sprinkled with references at the same time to Hegel, the founding fathers, Rauschenbusch, Abraham Lincoln, theologians like Barth and Tillich. In spite of those learned allusions, they had a lyrical quality. His delivery was kind of a sing-song cadence. One observer described it as a Baptist hum. He had a deep and powerful voice, a moving voice. And his speeches and sermons were rich with imagery. He could make the unlettered respond to quotations from St. Thomas Aquinas and from Hegel. One black woman, after hearing him preach, said, "I don't know what that boy's talking about, but I sure like the way he sounds." One woman journalist said, "His elocution has the beauty and polish of Roland Hayes singing a spiritual." It was Martin Luther King's oratory that gave fire to the boycott. His first speech, his first really public speech, was to that MIA, the Montgomery Improvement Association, and he had half an hour to prepare it. For King, that was nothing. He was used to taking an hour to crafting his sermons. But what he came up with was extraordinary. He said, there comes a time when people get tired. We are here this evening to say to those people who have mistreated us for so long that we are tired. Tired of being segregated and humiliated. Tired of being kicked about by the brutal feet of oppression. We have no alternative but to protest. For many years we've shown amazing patience. We've sometimes given our white brothers the feeling that we liked the way we were being treated. But we come here tonight to be saved from patience that makes us patient with anything less than freedom and justice. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, Jesus of Nazareth was merely a utopian dreamer who never came down to earth. If we are wrong, justice is a lie. It's an extraordinarily powerful speech, one that could move his followers to action and move his opponents at least to sympathy and respect. His most famous speech, of course, came in 1963 at the gathering on the Mall in Washington, D.C., once again seeking passage of civil rights legislation. There were 4 basic themes to that speech. I'm sure all of you have heard it, but you may not have spent time to think about what he really had to say. The first theme was now, the importance of now. The second was a call to action. Go back, continue the struggle. The third was I have a dream, and the fourth was let freedom ring. He started off by telling the audience, we've come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to open the doors of opportunity to all of God's children. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Later on, he urged his followers to continue the work that they'd begun. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. And then he talked about his dream, the most famous part of the speech. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a desert state sweltering with the heat and injustice of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will be judged by the color, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And then he concluded with the fourth theme, let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring from the curvaceous peaks of California, but not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia, let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi. That was powerful rhetoric. As I said, it moved his supporters to action. It won sympathy and respect even from opponents. And these qualities made King perhaps the ideal leader for the civil rights movement in those 10 or 11 years. King led a movement seeking integration, acceptance, incorporation into white society. And King was uniquely situated to lead that movement. King had roots deep in the black community, even though he'd led a privileged childhood. The church was so central to southern black communities, it gave King immediate credibility. And yet at the same time, King had the credentials, the qualities that the white power structure had to respect. He had the degrees, he had the education, he was learned, he was articulate. He was, in many ways, the perfect leader, spokesperson for this particular movement. I think there are 2 examples very early on in his career that illustrate what I'm saying here. One was at the early meeting of the Montgomery Improvement Association with the civic leaders of Montgomery. The Reverend E. Stanley Frazier, a prominent minister and a leading segregationist in the city, scolded the black leaders. He said that he lectured them on the Bible, and he said that it's the task of Christian preachers to lead souls to God, not to sow confusion by taking up social issues. Well, this is a powerful argument taken on its face, and Martin Luther King was the ideal individual to answer. Here was somebody who was a minister as well, who was more familiar with biblical exegesis, who had more education than Fraser and could answer him in his own terms and exceed even Fraser's eloquence. And another example would also come from those first days of the boycott. At the trial for the illegal boycott, Martin Luther King became the darling of reporters. Specifically, one incident made him a media celebrity in the day before anyone had ever coined the term. A reporter came down to ask him about the charge that he was a communist, a charge that plagued King throughout his life. King responded by giving a thumbnail sketch of Marxist ideology from Marx and Engels through Lenin, and explaining how his own ideology that was influenced by Hegel and Rauschenbusch and Tillich differed from it. What a story, this obscure black preacher from Montgomery, Alabama, who so articulately, without being condescending to the reporter, explained this to the reporter. It was a great news story, and they picked up on it. As I said, he was ideally situated to win the respect and the leadership of both the black community, the loyalty of the black community, and at the same time the respect of the white power structure with whom he had to deal, and with whom he could deal on their own terms comfortably. King was less effective in later years, partly because of the splits within the black movement, the emergence of black nationalism, but also because King himself was a Southern man, a profoundly Southern man. He was much more effective dealing with racism in Birmingham and Anniston than he was in Chicago. The issues were different. But for that 10 or 11 years after the Brown decision, King was perhaps the ideal leader for the civil rights movement. He shaped and led the movement. He was without doubt the most important individual, although many contributed and many sacrificed. His rhetoric shaped and inspired the movement, and he provided the movement with an ideology and a moral underpinning. And I think that's why we honor King today, not because he was a human being who had flaws, who cheated on his wife, who plagiarized parts of his doctoral dissertation. None of that changes what King actually accomplished, especially in that 10 or 11-year period. And I think that it's a good thing to take some time and reflect on this. Martin Luther King really wasn't the Martin Luther King who celebrated on King Day. Everybody didn't like Martin Luther King. He was an agitator. As he put it, he was a drum major for change. And as such, he had enemies. He was assassinated. He was murdered. He wasn't a comfortable icon that we'd like to celebrate. He was somebody who led a fight for racial justice, a fight which went a long way, largely because of Martin Luther King, but is by no means completed today. He was courageous. He was visionary. He was the ideal leader for his movement at the time in which he emerged as the leader of the movement. And it seems to me that that ought to be enough. And if we want to wait around for a saint, as I said, we'll wait an awfully long time. Maybe we ought to be satisfied with Martin Luther King Jr. And I'd be glad to take any questions. You know, if you recall, he led a march through Chicago and was encountered. The issue was open housing, and he encountered a hostile a white mob. And there are a couple of things. First, the issue in the South was ending legal segregation, a system that was so palpably evil and demonstrably unjust that it was easy to turn it into a morality play. Many of you, at least, if not all of you, are old enough to remember seeing pictures in the early 60s on the news of polite, well-dressed blacks exercising their constitutional right to express their views being attacked with police dogs and fire hoses and police swinging clubs. It was easy to turn that into a simple morality play. The issues in the North were a little more complicated. There weren't legal housing segregation ordinances in the North. There weren't housing ordinances in the South either. They'd been declared unconstitutional early on. But there weren't the kind of legal issues that could easily be demonstrated. The issues were more complicated. And King was a little less comfortable dealing with them. He was familiar with the South. He was less familiar with the North. What's more, he was very much a part of Southern black communities. He was a Southern black preacher. He could walk into any community in the South and step up on the sermon and be at home and be comfortable, and the people would be comfortable with him. He was less comfortable in dealing with northern urban black communities. He was less effective in dealing with these communities. And he also, I think, he not only represented in some way resistance to emerging black nationalism, but in many ways he was out of touch with it. He was out of tune with the underprivileged black masses who were attracted by Malcolm X and the black Muslims, who were really the down and outers, for whom traditional black organizations, SCLC, the National Urban League, the the NAACP really had no attraction and had never been very effective with. The Muslims were. And so in many ways, the issues had moved past. And this shouldn't surprise us. Very often, leaders at certain stages of a movement are less well equipped to lead at a later stage. It wasn't that King was any less an individual than he had been, but the movement itself had splintered. No one could have held it together. You had militants that came out of SNCC like Stokely Carmichael and Rap Brown. You had the emerging Black Panther movement. You had the various forms of black nationalism, most notably the Muslims. Nobody could have held that together. And we shouldn't be surprised that King didn't or King couldn't. It's not a failing. It's the fact that the movement had moved on. One of the worst things that can happen to a movement is to gain most of its goals. And the goals of the movement King led had been achieved by 1965. Legal segregation had been ended. But that revealed more problems than it solved. And how to address the new problems? Well, that was for really, in some ways, for another generation to solve. And just as slavery itself wasn't solved by our founding fathers, 2 generations later had to fight a war to resolve it. And in those senses, he was less effective after 1965. But even that's not, I don't think, so much because of failings in his character or in his leadership. It's in the changing circumstances around him. And even that doesn't diminish what he achieved between 54 and 55 and 64, 65, the general decade. Comment about whether what I thought the future of Martin Luther King Day might be, would it degenerate into a kind of President's Day thing? Well, I hope not. Certainly at this stage, it's fresh enough. There's commitment. Bob Booker, who led the sit-in movement in Knoxville, Tennessee, now leads an active movement commemorating King in Knoxville. I think that there really is a time to pause and reflect, at least at this point. I don't know. I hope it won't become a celebration of a plastic saint, and I hope it won't become a day we go to the mall and buy Reeboks on sale because Martin Luther King's birthday happened to be within that rough week. I mean, I think it's certainly too late for President's Days, but I hope that this is one national holiday that will continue to be a time to pause and reflect, partly because the agenda that King sketched out is still so much undone. So much remains to be done. That it's a good time to stop and think about a lot of things, about leadership, about what we expect from our leaders, about the course that this country's taking in terms of racial equality and racial justice. And if it serves that purpose, I think it'll be an admirable thing, and I hope it will. And gatherings like this, listening to reflections on what King actually was about, I think help in that direction. I hope it doesn't become a sale day.